Alright, welcome to another edition of the FantasyFix.com podcast. I'm your host, Brett Talley, and today I'm here to talk a little 2014 fantasy football draft strategy. Basically been doing baseball daily fantasy strategy on the podcast for the last 4 months or whatever, but today we're going to start talking a little football draft strategy, and I'm going to be doing a bunch of little short podcasts over the next few weeks touching on various topics to help you get ready for your draft. First topic I want to discuss today is why you should wait on quarterback. I think the strategy of waiting on quarterback has become pretty popular, definitely over the last few years, maybe even longer than that, but the general thinking is harder to find running backs and receivers later in the draft that you can use on a regular basis, not as difficult to find quarterbacks later. You also have the option of streaming quarterbacks a little bit more. You can go week to week. You can plug in Ryan Tannehill against, I'm trying to think of a bad secondary from last year. It's been so long I can't even remember, but whatever. You can plug in a guy like Tannehill who's not owned in many leagues when he has good matchups, and it's not always going to work out, but that is a plausible strategy, and it is a way that you can get production week to week out of the quarterback position. You can't do that at running back or receiver, especially running back for the most part. Anybody who's got a chance of getting double-digit carries is probably owned. You just can't stream. It's not an option. So that's one reason why you can wait on quarterback, because if whoever you draft doesn't work out, you have sort of a built-in fallback option. Not the case with the running backs and the receivers. I think the other argument is that there's just so many good quarterbacks now that there's no point in getting one of the best ones up at the top when you can get good production later in the draft. Now, I think a lot of people who, my guess is, and I'm not one of these people, so I'm having to assume here, but I think part of the argument for the people who want to take a quarterback early, to want to take one of those elite quarterbacks, is twofold. I think they would say that they're so much better than the other guys at the position that they warrant taking them in the second or third round or something like that. It gives you such an advantage week to week over guys who wait on quarterback. And the other argument would be that because quarterbacks score the most points, you want to get the highest point scorer, and having those elite quarterbacks is going to help you score the most points each week, and they can win you matchups. So I think the problem with that is that it assumes that the top quarterbacks have a bigger gap between them and the rest of quarterbacks, as opposed to the best running backs or receivers having bigger gaps than the other running backs and receivers. So if we could show that the gap between the top quarterbacks and the mid-tier quarterbacks was the same as or less than the gap between the top backs and receivers and the mid-tier backs and receivers, then the argument that they're so much better at their position then the other guys would go out the window, because it's all relative. You know what I mean? If it doesn't matter as much anymore when the backs and receivers have a bigger gap. And so to look at that, I want to use something called Z-scores. Z-scores tells us, let's say you've got a set of projections for the 2014 season, and let's use quarterback as an example. For the top 20 quarterbacks, in my projection, the average projection is 283 points. That's the average for the top 20 quarterbacks for the season. For anybody that's projected for 28 points more than 283, so what would that be? 311. Anybody over 310 basically is projected to be at least one standard deviation or more above the mean. So, for example, Drew Brees is projected for 320, so that's more than 310. He has a Z-score of 1.34, meaning he's projected to be 1.34 standard deviations better than the mean. Okay? So, let's take a look at these Z-scores by position to see whether the gap between the top quarterbacks and the mid-tier quarterbacks is bigger than the gap between backs and receivers. Alright, so with quarterbacks, we've got three guys who who are going to projected to be more than one standard deviation better than the mean. Aaron Rodgers, Drew Brees, and Peyton Manning is projected to be just over 2 standard deviations better than the mean with a z-score of 2.05. So we've got 3 guys above 1.3 and 1 guy above 2. Take a look at the running backs, and we've got 1 guy above 2, but we've got 7 other guys projected to be above 1.3. So what we're talking about here, and now I know we play more running backs than quarterbacks, and so that factors into this a little bit, but essentially we have Jamal Charles at the top of my running back projections with a z-score of 2.24, which is higher than Manning, and then we've got 7 other guys that are basically in the Rodgers and Brees range. So again, we play more running backs, and I understand that that's going to mean that more of them are going to have a high z-score, but to me, that basically, let's say we play 2.5 running backs a week. If you're in a 2 running back league with a flex spot, say that flex goes half running back, half receiver. So that means in a 10-team league, you're going to have 25 running backs played every week. You're going to have 1 quarterback played every week. So we've got 2 guys. We've got Charles and Manning, who are both way up there, and then we have 2 other quarterbacks and 7 other running backs that are in that same range of being 1.3 standard deviations above the mean or more. 7 running backs equals 2 quarterbacks, essentially. I mean, if we did 2 times 2.5, we'd get, what, 5? So we've got 7 running backs. I think that stacks up well against only 2 quarterbacks in that range. Wouldn't say that the top quarterbacks are further from the pack than the top running backs are from the pack. All right, now let's talk receivers. This is where things get interesting. With receivers, we've got 4 guys that are 2 standard deviations or more, projected to be 2 standard deviations or more better than the mean. I've got Johnson, Julio Jones, Dez Bryant, Demaryius Thomas, all projected to be far better than 2 standard deviations better than the mean. And then in that above 1.3 range, we've got another 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 guys. And then there's a huge drop-off after the top 9. When I have 9, I have A.J. Green. And then we fall all the way down from 1.37 with A.J. Green. That's his z-score, to 1 with Andre Johnson. So I would argue this year we've got receivers that are way ahead of the pack, much more so than quarterbacks and running backs. So it's really hard for me to say that it's a good idea for you to take a top quarterback in one of the 2nd or 3rd rounds. And let's put some numbers on this. Let me see where Rodgers and Brees are going, because that's what we're talking about. I'm sort of potentially okay with you taking Manning because he is further out than the rest. Okay, Manning is going, I'm using some ESPN ADP here, but Peyton Manning is going 4th overall in average draft position. That I can't support. I've got 4 receivers and a running back that are projected to be further above the mean at their respective position than Manning, so I couldn't go that high on him. And then we've got Rodgers going at 10, and we've got Brees going at 13. But then some of the guys I mentioned, here are guys going after Rodgers and Brees that have a much higher, here are receivers going after Rodgers and Brees that have a much higher z-score than Rodgers and Brees, meaning they are further above the average at their respective position than Rodgers and Brees are at theirs. Demaryius Thomas, A.J. Green, Dez Bryant, Brandon Marshall, Julio Jones, Jordy Nelson. Let me make sure that... Yes, all of those guys are projected to, in my projections, be further above the mean at receiver than Rodgers and Brees are at the quarterback position. So there's no way I can justify taking Rodgers and Brees in the 2nd round as opposed to those receivers if the argument is that those guys are far better than the other guys at their position. Okay, and I don't like the argument that they score the most points and that's why you should take them early. It's all relative. It should all be compared to what they're doing against guys at their own position. Okay, so pass on all those guys. If Peyton Manning fell to, past the top 4 or 5 running backs and past the top 4 receivers, which is never going to happen, he's never going to fall past those top 4 receivers, then you could do it. But it's just not going to happen. All those guys are always going to be after him, and I would wait and take all of them every time. one other point I want to make is as to why you should wait on quarterback. The guys I've got projected to be quarterbacks 7 through 12, and that group includes Matthew Stafford, RG3, Tony Romo, Tom Brady, Matt Ryan, and Andrew Luck. Those are my 7 through 12 quarterbacks. I've got them projected to finish within 12 points of each other at the end of the year. So those 6 guys are projected to be no more, or to be less than 1 fantasy point per game different. They're interchangeable. I don't see any reason to value one of those guys that much more than the other. If you like one of them in particular, fine. A lot of people like Andrew Luck. I bet a lot of people like Stafford. But for me, Ryan is going 90th overall with ADP. Romo, 102. Brady, 67. I just wait. I mean, I don't see a big enough difference between those guys to justify, taking any one of them in the top 60 picks. There's just no point in doing it. So, one other note, going back to the Z-scores, tight ends, Jimmy Graham, way out in front of everybody else. He's better than any running back in terms of Z-score. He's better than any quarterback. The only guy who's got him beat in terms of Z-score is Calvin Johnson. So, if those top 4 or 5 running backs go and then Calvin Johnson goes and you want to take Jimmy Graham in the back half of the first round, I got no problem with that at all. His ADP is 9th overall. I think that's pretty much right on the money. Got no problem taking him there. But quarterbacks, they're just not that much better than the rest of their position, no matter what the big raw numbers they put up may make it look like. So wait and get them late.